Hey, welcome to another Fundamental Friday. I'm Tyler Bourne, the lead concept artist working with Tyler Edlin over at Brushsaw Studio. So a really great way to add visual interest to our pieces, whether it be an illustration or a prop or character design or something, is contrast. Contrast adds a lot of visual interest and it allows us to lead the viewer's eye where we want it to go. For example, the focal point. And when I say contrast, what probably comes to mind is value contrast, light versus dark. But that's only one example of contrast. In reality, there's many more. So let's look at some examples. So as I've mentioned, we have value, which is light versus dark. But then we also have size contrast, such as big shapes versus small shapes. Most of these, by the way, can be reversed, so a small shape will stand out among a bunch of larger shapes. Next we have hue or color, and what I mean by this is warmer colors versus cool colors. One hue in isolation will stand out against the rest. The same thing happens with saturation. You can work with higher saturation and lower saturation. A typically higher saturation tends to draw our eye. Next we have shape contrast. If you have one shape that's different from all the rest, it'll stand out. Then we have direction contrast, and this refers to the direction of our brush strokes or mark making. Then we've got contrast in density, which is noise versus areas of rest. Then we've got contrast in the edges of our mark making, so hard edges versus softer edges. Again, hard edges tend to draw our eye a little bit more, especially if they're surrounded by softer edges. Next, we've got texture contrast, which is texture versus no texture. Typically, one area with a lot of fidelity or texture will draw our eye. It's similar to the density noise versus rest one. Then we have contrast in our brush strokes. You can have tighter, more refined brush strokes versus looser, more expressive brush strokes. So let's take a look at some artist examples.
Hey, I wanted to thank you, Tyler B, for coming over onto the channel this week and giving everybody an awesome demo. And I wanted to let you guys know it's thanks to you and your generous support over on the Brushsauce Patreon that we are able to make content like this possible. So of course we have links below for everything, as well as we are running, Tyler and I, the other Tyler and I, are running a group mentorship via Patreon as well. You guys can check availability on that. The newsletter, of course, has all that kind of info and upcoming release dates. With that said, I'll let Tyler get back and do his thing. Catch you guys later.
So the first one we were discussing is your simple value contrast, dark versus light and light versus dark. In this example by John Sweeney, you can see that there is no guesswork as to what our focal point is. It's the darkest part of the image sitting right up next to the lightest part of the image. So it's the area of highest contrast. While you can have all kinds of contrast or lack thereof throughout your piece, typically the areas of highest contrast will draw our eye. So typically you find these in your focal point. Both these examples from John Sweeney are a dark shape over a light shape, but the opposite is also true. In this example by Nick Gendreau, you can see that here we've got our lightest shape right up against our darkest shape. So our eye goes here as a focal point. This piece is also a good example for our next option, which is size contrast. Here, this big sort of antenna radar dish thing is our main focal point. And you can see that while there are variations of smaller shapes and medium shapes throughout the piece, this by and large stands out purely because it's so much bigger than everything else. The opposite is also true. You can see that in this example from Martin Deschambault, we have a small little spaceship flying through our scene. It's surrounded by these giant clam or oyster type shapes. And while there are a lot of size variations for these objects, because you want a variation of big, medium, and small, by and large, all of these objects are quite big compared to our ship, which is relatively small. This helps the ship stand out amongst these larger shapes. Next is hue or color contrast. Here we have an example by an artist you may be familiar with, Tyler Edlin. You can see that most of this piece are cooler colors. It's mostly blues and purples and greens. And while green can be either cool or warm, and we start to get a few little warmer hues in the green, I'd say overall the greens of the vegetation in this piece are cooler greens. And then we have this lens piece, which by far is the warmest color in the illustration. We also get a few pieces here and there With all of these examples, yes, we want to draw attention to a focal point, but typically we don't want it to stand out so much that it sticks out like a sore thumb or feels alien to the piece. So you can draw attention to your focal point and then pepper in a few little areas that help support your focal point. And again, even though these are mostly cooler colors, I would say this patch of grass that starts to get a little bit warmer is also helping to support that warmer tone in the focal point. Another example of this is from Simon Stalenhag. Again, we have a predominantly very cool kind of color palette here. And then this house, which is our focal point, starts to get some warmer colors. Even though this is hugely desaturated because we're in a cool environment, we get some sort of reddish brown colors there. And then we get some warmer sort of tans and oranges, even though they're diluted because of the cool environment. And then finally, of course, we get the nice hot spot of warm color. Similar to the hue and color, we can look at saturation, saturated colors versus desaturated colors. This is a great example from Eitan Zana here, where we can see that our focal point here and some of the surrounding areas get a shock of saturation. By contrast, the rest of the piece is very desaturated. It's actually a very grayscale piece, and that makes the saturation of the sand stand out that much more. Here's another example from Martin Deschambault. And you can see that because the fire has such strong saturation in it, the rest of the piece is very desaturated and feels dull by comparison. This draws our eye to the focal point. Next we have shape contrast. Typically we want to use a variation of shapes in our illustrations or pieces. And by having some shapes play against other ones, we can purposefully draw the viewer's eye. Notice that in this piece by Eitan, most of the shapes, because they're natural sort of vegetative shapes, a lot of them are rounder forms. So we start getting a lot of this sort of thing happening. Everything is arcs, everything is curves, and everything is relatively soft. By contrast, our focal point, which is this big rock here, is by far the most square or rectangular shape. Again, you don't necessarily want these things completely in a vacuum because it might stand out a little bit too much. So we start getting a little bit more of these little square shapes here. The harder edges among the softer edges of the vegetation. But you can see that even in the rocks, as we move away from the focal point, even they start getting rounder. We start seeing some of those arcing rounded shapes on the rock, sandy kind of areas by the shore here. We also see that some of the rocks start to get rounded off here just a little bit here as we're still close to the focal point, and then these ones get more of that rounded shape. Even these ones here, they're a little bit stronger in shape with some hard edges, but overall they're a lot more rounded than this one. Here's another example from Eitan, and really we have sort of the same thing happening here. A lot of the vegetation has more sort of rounded, softer shapes to it, with the rolling hills here. You see, we get a lot of these natural, rounded, sort of organic shapes. And by contrast, the castle is so man-made, it's so hard-edged, that it stands out. This really helps to make it stand out among all of the more organic shapes of the surrounding landscape. This piece also demonstrates our next example, which is contrast of direction. We've already established that this man-made hard-edged surface of the castle stands out against the more organic forms of the landscape. But the landscape also creates a lot of fairly horizontal lines here. I'd say almost the entire piece is roughly horizontal lines. And again, by contrast, we get a lot of vertical lines happening in our focal point here with the castle. So of course, if it wasn't already obvious, you can compound all of these different examples together. You're not necessarily using one or the other. You can use any kind of combination of any of them. Next, let's look at contrast between noise and area of rest. This example from Sparth is a really obvious one. Our focal point, which is the ship and a few little other areas of interest, smaller ships, are really the only areas that have any real sort of detail or fidelity to them. They're the ones that get the most visual noise, so that's where our eye goes. In contrast, the background is just these really wispy clouds. We don't see much, there's not much to look at there, so these provide areas of rest. You need a good balance between these because our eyes do need to rest within the image. If it's all chaotic all the time, then nothing's special. If everything is special, then nothing is special. So you do want a decent balance. In this example, I would say most of the piece is areas of rest, and most of the noise is just in our focal point. So that's where our eye is being led. Here's another example from Ian McHugh, and you can see that the same thing is happening here. I apologize, the quality of this image I know is quite poor, but it still depicts the idea quite nicely. Look at all the little brushwork happening here, all the little shapes, the variation of values and hues. There's a lot of visual noise happening here in this machinery. But by contrast, there's not much going on in sort of this grassy hill type landscape or in the sky in the background. It's a lot of just kind of smoky haze. We don't see much going on. Because of this, our eye is drawn to the higher fidelity of the machinery. But you can see from this example from Max Hay here that the opposite is happening. This image has so much detail and so much fidelity. There's a lot going on everywhere. And again, of course, there's a few different things happening, one of which is we get our brightest bright happening here. But I would argue that we also get our largest area of rest amidst this sea of detail. And that will draw our eye. Next, we've got hard edges versus soft edges. You can see here in this Smarth example that most of the brushwork in the background is all quite soft, whereas a lot of the edges in the spaceship start to get a lot more hard and more defined. The same thing happens in this piece from John Singer Sargent. In our focal point, which is the face, we've got some pretty strong hard edges happening. Whereas, as we move further away from the focal point, our edges become softer, and in some cases are lost entirely. Once again, in this example from Marco Bucci, we get a lot of hard edges in the foreground elements, especially the tree bark here, and some of the lines in the birds themselves. Those shapes become bolder, and the edges of those shapes have a harder edge to them. Whereas in the background, all of our edges are extremely soft. Next, let's look at contrast of texture. Areas of more texture versus areas of less texture. In this example from Andreas Rocha, we can see that our main tree here gets the highest fidelity, and the texture is most obvious, whereas other trees in the background and moving away from the focal point are getting softer and softer. For an even bolder message, he's got that stronger texture right up against the softer backdrop, where there's no texture. Here's another example of the same thing from Grady Frederick. You can see that Grady is putting all of his texture in the cabin or building itself. There's some hints of texture happening on the ground plane, but it's more subdued. And then by the time we get to these rocks in the background and the clouds in the sky, there's no details or textures showing through at all. They're just becoming bold shapes. Here's an even bolder example from Grady. Now this one is a study, so overall there just is less time put into things like texture. But you can see that he did still put a bit of time into putting texture into this building and the rocks. Once we get to the ground plane, the clouds, and the sky, there is no texture whatsoever. Lastly, let's look at brushwork. In this example from John Park, you can see that in our focal point with the character and the horse, the brushwork starts to get a little bit tighter, the sizes of the shapes get a little bit smaller. He's effectively defining his subject more specifically with tighter brushwork. Whereas things like foliage on the ground gets a lot looser and a lot more expressive. He's just sort of hinting that there's some sort of vegetation, but we don't really know what it is. We can sort of guess that it's patches of grass or bushes or something, maybe a few little cacti here and there. But we don't really know because it's not that important. He's leaving the brushwork be loose because he just wants to indicate for context. As we move back in the distance, the brushwork becomes even bigger and bolder. Here's another example from John, and you can see that in our focal point, the brushwork starts getting tighter and more defined. Whereas in the background, this is very loose and expressive. You'll notice with the last few examples we looked at, things like noise versus areas of rest, the hard edges versus soft edges, texture versus no texture, and tight brushstrokes versus loose brushstrokes, we're essentially achieving the same ends. Really what we're doing is having some areas with higher fidelity and then some areas with lower fidelity. With the soft edges, we're essentially getting less detail because everything is being blurred. And we're effectively doing the same thing with the looser, more expressive brush strokes. But you can see that technically there are still some pretty hard edges in this brushwork. But it is getting looser and less refined than in our focal point. Okay, thanks for sticking around and watching. I hope this gives you some ideas for future pieces. Do let us know in the comments what you'd like to see in future Fundamental Fridays. As always, thanks to Tyler Edlin for having me back on the channel. I co-run the group mentorship with Tyler Edlin over on his Patreon, so definitely check that out. The link will be in the description below. You can also check out my channel here on YouTube. The link to that will also be in the description. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Okay, bye.